Thanks, Jamie. Really interesting insights. I think great minds think alike. I'm going to give you some tips and tricks and what you can do to improve your digital accessibility. And just to give you a bit of background of what I do, I'm currently head of UX, a company called ANS. I used to be UK Fast, and we do, supposedly, I have to promote them, don't I? We do cloud hosting and things like that. Before, I've built sites and apps for Childline, things like that. And I worked on the first UK certified mobile banking app to be accessible, and we made it fully accessible, which was a big job and brought in loads and loads of skills, but it was a really good piece of work and really helped to level the playing field. And actually, when we did that piece, we got our usability from people without disabilities saying how much easier it was to use just by doing that piece of work. And I think that is the point, isn't it? That accessibility for me is very easy and very simple to do. And it's about just thinking about it from the start. And it's when you go, is it a nice thing to do or should I do it after? And that's probably a bit late. And some people go, oh, I think it's nice to do. It's not our target audience, or we'll put it on the roadmap, things like that. And it's not really. So I've boiled down some numbers. So this is what I do to, like, when I go to CEOs and talk to them and say, this is what we need to do for accessibility. This is what I share. I will, when I find my myriad of windows. Cool. There we go. So as you can see, more than 1 billion people around the world have very limited access to digital products. And I think, Jamie, you mentioned it. I think just under 98% of website homepages have at least one inaccessible thing on their website, which is a massive amount of, like, you think about all those websites all over the place. That's a massive amount of like, why are you stopping people from doing stuff? Why are you not doing it? And when people say, oh, it's not our target audience, would you sell your product to 1 billion less people than you would normally? And most people go, no, when you put it like that. And that has a market share just in the UK of £249 billion. So when we stop accessibility on websites, we're actually losing revenue of just under £250 billion, which is a staggering amount. And interesting, I always use this as well, and this came from a study in Microsoft in 2003. And actually, when you break it down, 79% of society requires some level of accessibility. And this might be temporary accessibility. So for example, glasses, some people might have their arm in a sling for a month or so. And then it goes up to more severe accessibility needs, Jamie, and when you're using tabbing through stuff and things like that. But actually 79% of society requires some level of accessibility. So when you say it's just a nice thing to do, actually 79% of the people rely on that to do that. And you wouldn't kind of stop people. You wouldn't. I think when you were on a Faster Horses podcast, Scott, you talked about crossing the road and having that accessibility, about people parking across the road, and kind of like, you wouldn't put spikes up on the middle of the road and across it just to stop 79% of the people crossing it and things like that. You wouldn't go out of the way to stop people doing it, but people go out of the way to stop people having some level of accessibility in digital. And interesting, e-commerce sites, more than 4 million people abandon a website because of its barriers and their poor accessibility. And that's 4 million people. And that equates to £17.1 million in lost sales. And that was just in 2019 alone. £17.1 million in lost sales because you're not doing a few simple things on your website or digital product, which is absolutely crazy. What can we do? So I've got 5 easy steps for everybody to do and what they can do to help make their website or And you can apply this to whatever. You can apply this to PowerPoint, you can apply it to social media, anything digital you can apply it to. If you've got a website, you can check your current accessibility score inside Google Chrome. If you've got the developer tools turned on, if not, go into the settings, turn on developer tools. There's a tab there called Lighthouse. Click on that and you can press run an accessibility score, and it'll give you a percentage score of what you're accessible. I ran this on medium.com and it's got a score of 71%, and it gives you a few tips and tricks then to solve it. If you want to go into a bit more detail, Microsoft made this brilliant tool called accessibilityinsights.io, and you can go on there and it will give you a step-by-step guide of going through your website or digital service. You can do it on Android apps and everything, and it'll give you steps you need to take to resolve all the problems and all the issues. I'll put some links on here. I can share these around after, and we can put them in the chat and things like that later. Color contrast. This as a designer, this is really easy to do. One of my favorite tools at the minute is this tool from Cloudflare, and you can go,
I'm not sure.
Apologies. And you can go on this tool, you can put in your website, it'll get your color palette and it'll give you the color contrast ratios for everything on your site. So it'll give you some sample text, how the colors look on different backgrounds, which is quite nice. And a lot of people, when they talk about color contrast ratios, they think of it as just text on a colored background, but it's icons, it's your buttons, it's loads more things. And how visible are those things when you put them on a colored background? Or you see these lovely glassy things with transparent backgrounds, which make it impossible to see icons and small things. And it gives you examples of how a form would look, how a button would look, and how a radio button and things like that. And it's really good. In here as well, I've put a list to about 30 odd color contrast checking tools. You can do black and white. So if you suffer from photopia, I think it is. So if you're colorblind, you can check out those tools and it'll simulate what your screen looks like with those. Like red and greens are very similar. They look like browns. So what I always say as well, don't ever use color just to determine anything at all. So if you're just using green as a kind of a go, or you've got something filled in green, that wouldn't translate to everybody, and it doesn't translate to globally as well. So I've worked on global products, and red's quite a negative color in the West, but when you go to Eastern countries, red is quite a positive color. So you have to work out those kind of things as well. So when you just use color to say that's a positive or negative, then don't do it. We put textures on our bar charts and our graphs so that if you were totally colorblind, you could still tell what those graphs meant and what they did. So do that. Don't be afraid of large fonts. When I see a lot of people, they go, oh yeah, but I want to fit everything above the fold. And if you know about that thing in digital, the above the fold is basically what your laptop or your screen can see. Anything below the fold is what it can't see. And when you do large fonts, you get some people go in, oh, I can't see my contents too far down, it's below the fold. But actually, when you use large content, it splits the words up. It makes it easier to read. If you're dyslexic, it makes it easier to read. It splits down that information and it makes it more digestible, and your services become a lot more accessible. Never use light or thin fonts. A lot of designers do this, and they use kind of like, they think they're being really artsy and classy by using a really thin font, and it's like really hard to read. I always say, if you use the squint test, and if you can't see it, you can't read it when you use the squint test, then it's probably not accessible for anybody else. Use a minimum size of 16-point fonts. A lot of people, I think the old Apple interface guidelines said use a minimum of 11, 12-point fonts, but that was when they had tiny phones. But now people have got bigger phones and people can zoom in and out when they want. But if you use 16 as a base, as your smallest, and then go up, it makes everything so much easier to read. Avoid using uppercase letters. And Jamie, you mentioned it in your hashtags and things like that, using camel case, using proper structured sentences. And I don't know why social media don't I also apply this or use a bit of AI to solve it. But I see people put, because they want to shout about it, and they put things in uppercase, and to screen readers, it's just words and shouting out. To people with dyslexia, it makes it really hard to understand those words. And then when you've got everything shouting at you, if you suffer from anxiety, it can make you really uneasy using the website. There shouldn't be something really disturbing to use. So some of those things. Number 4, I've included this image here, alt text when appropriate. And I think this is really key on social media. Put your alt text when you're using an image, because you've added that image for a reason. So describe it. What's it doing? What's that image doing? And it would say, if the image adds to the story, you need to tell what that image is and make it part of the story, make it part of words. Some of the common misconceptions and problems I see is people just put in the image name. So stock image 5 is a very common one. And you imagine that as a screen reader, reading that out to you at 300 times on a website is really, really mundane. You don't want to go through all that. Simplifying alt text as well. I did this illustration of commander data from Star Trek holding a giant gem, reflecting a laser beam with padlock icons in the background. I did it as a bit of a joke because you can simplify this to data holding a gem. And if you haven't seen the image, that becomes a very different image than the one I've actually illustrated here. So just take those things into consideration and think of it as a story. And if your image is part of the story, to write it in words and describe it. Another misconception I see is the overuse of alt tags. And especially if you've got like a bullet list of icons, you can have alt padlock, alt plushie, alt circle, alt shard, and then it'll read a sentence. And then those bullet points become nonsensical because they're just lots more words are added into it. If you don't actually add to the story, if it's just for decoration, then put a blank space between the alt text, and then that will eliminate it from the screen readers. Otherwise, you're just bombarding people. But then with the screen reader, you're actually telling people thousands and thousands of times exactly what you're doing. So yeah, within reason, and don't explain things. And if it's decoration only, leave it out, because that's more stuff for the screen readers to read and more stuff that you've got to go through to get to the content you want. And Jamie, you saying that little digital accessibility is a button thing on top. Reading through all this extra alt text, it bugs me talking about it, let alone go through it when you're reading it. Keep it simple. Interestingly, the average attention span on the web is about less than 8 seconds, and that is less than a goldfish memory. On social media, it's about less than 4 seconds. And like, people with accessibility needs are still people, and the average time before people become frustrated and leave is around 8 seconds. And you can see, if you've got Google Analytics run on your site, you'll see this and you'll see your bounce rate. And if people get frustrated with hearing all those alt tags, or if they get frustrated with tabbing through thousands of things before finding exactly what they want to find, then they're going to be frustrated and leave. I always say a digital experience isn't any different from a physical experience. And if you were running a shop and you put all your nice stuff behind barriers for people to jump over, hurdles for people to get through, tape they have to break through, would you sell that product behind those barriers? You just wouldn't. Make it less complicated. Don't put everything, and don't think you have to put everything on one page. Break up. Same with presentations. The amount of presentations I see, and people say, oh, it's got to be a one-pager. So then they put about 3,000 words of one page of a presentation. And I don't mind going through pages and pages. Interesting, CVs are the same. If you've got a CV with 20 pages, I will quite happily read a CV with 20 pages. If you give me a CV with one page with tiny text on, I'll tell you exactly where that CV is going. And it's not good. So just think about that, just break things down. And how would you want to be spoken to if you were visiting? If your digital product was a shop, how would you want that to be perceived if it was a real thing and a real store? That's it, my top 5 tips. Thank you. I've been Paul Wilshaw. Check out, and this is my shameless plug for my podcast, Faster Horses, and my website.